The wind, a raw, scraping thing, was already tearing at the loose shutters of the tiny, borrowed cabin as Alara spooned the last of the instant coffee into a chipped mug. It wasn't just coffee, it was her final, pitiful shield against the encroaching chill of solitude and the ever-present thrum of anxiety. She was down to a handful of crackers, half a candle, and this, the dregs of a stolen normalcy. Water was already on the small, sputtering wood stove, the only source of heat. Outside, the Oregon pines thrashed, their scent sharp and wild, a constant reminder of how far she was from everything she'd once known, and everything she was desperate to escape. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you believe love should feel like freedom, hit that like button and subscribe. She had been Alara Vance, a name whispered in financial columns and splashed across society pages. Now, she was just a woman with very little coffee, hiding in a cabin that wasn't technically hers, belonging to a reclusive uncle of a college friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Her presence here was a secret whispered into a sympathetic ear, a last resort. The stakes were simple. If they found her, the gilded cage would slam shut again, this time with thicker bars. That it was a nebulous cloud of family expectations, a suffocating fiancé chosen for mergers not love, and a life mapped out like a sterile boardroom agenda. This sputtering stove, this last cup of coffee, was her rebellion. A sudden, violent rapping at the door made her jump, coffee powder dusting her worn jeans. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one knew she was here. No one. The rapping came again, more desperate this time, punctuated by a gust of wind that sounded like a mournful howl. She froze, every instinct screaming at her to stay silent, to douse the lamp. But then, a sound cut through the storm, a human sound, a pained groan. It was the kind of sound that bypassed fear and went straight for a part of her she thought had withered. Slowly, she moved to the door, peering through a tiny crack in the warped wood. A man was slumped against the frame, his shoulders hunched, his form indistinct in the gray, swirling twilight of the premature storm. He was large, but he looked collapsed. And he was shivering, a violent, teeth-chattering tremor she could almost feel through the door. He wasn't a threat. He was an icicle in a plaid jacket. And just like that, a stranger, half-frozen and clearly in distress, became a complication her carefully hoarded solitude couldn't ignore. Alara, or Ellie, as she'd tentatively started calling herself in the quiet of her own mind, spent her days in a state of suspended animation. She'd wake with the weak dawn light, her breath misting in the frigid air of the cabin, and the first thought was always, are they looking? The cabin itself was a study in rustic neglect, dusty, smelling of old wood and damp earth, but with a certain stubborn charm. A worn armchair faced a stone fireplace that she hadn't dared use yet, fearing the smoke would be too obvious a signal. Her world had shrunk to these four walls, the small pantry with its dwindling supplies, and the relentless, whispering forest outside. She'd learned to make the silence a companion, a stark contrast to the cacophony of her previous life, filled with ringing phones, imperative demands, and the hollow chatter of society functions. Here, the loudest sounds were the crackle of the wood stove, the scuttling of some small creature in the walls, and the frantic beating of her own heart whenever a twig snapped too loudly nearby. Her only tenuous link to the outside world was a battered battery-operated radio she'd found, which mostly picked up static and the occasional mournful country song. One afternoon, while trying to coax a signal, a news snippet had crackled through, clipped and official, about a prominent East Coast family, the Vances, appealing for information regarding their beloved daughter, Alara, who has taken an uncharacteristic leave of absence. Beloved. The word had tasted like ash in her mouth. They were looking, all right, not out of love, but out of a desire to reclaim their asset, to smooth over the scandal of her disappearance before it impacted the upcoming merger her marriage was supposed to cement. The isolation was a double-edged sword. It was freedom, a breath of clean, pine-scented air after years of breathing the recycled, perfumed atmosphere of penthouse apartments and private jets. But it was also a gnawing loneliness, a quiet so profound it sometimes felt like a weight on her chest. She was discovering that running away was easy, staying hidden, and finding a reason to was the hard part. She'd begun to feel a fragile sort of peace in the rhythm of chopping kindling, badly, boiling water for tea, now coffee, and watching the deer that sometimes ventured into the clearing. It was a peace so new, so delicate, that the thought of it being shattered was a constant, low hum of dread beneath the surface. This was her chance to discover who Alara could be without the Vance name, without the expectations. The thought that it could all be snatched away was terrifying. The man at the door, the shivering stranger, was a disruption she couldn't afford. He was also, undeniably, in need. Her father would have called security. Her fiancé, Sterling, would have looked right through him, as if he were an inconvenient piece of furniture. Alara, the girl who'd once signed 5-figure checks for charity galas without a second thought, now hesitated over a cup of instant coffee. The irony wasn't lost on her. She unlatched the door slowly. The wind tore it from her grip, slamming it open against the interior wall. The man practically stumbled inside, a blast of icy air and pine needles following him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face ruddy with cold, dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain or melted snow. His lips were tinged with blue. "Sorry," he managed, his voice a rough rasp. Storm came up fast. Gut turned around. He was looking past her, at the small fire in the stove, his eyes filled with a desperate longing for warmth. "You're freezing," she stated, the obvious hanging heavy in the small space. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but his visible suffering was more immediate. "Ben," he said, extending a hand that trembled visibly. "Ben Carter." She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Ellie." It felt strange to say the name aloud to someone else. He nodded, too cold for pleasantries. "Got anything? Warm?" Her gaze flicked to the mug on the small table, the one with her last precious coffee. It was a lifeline, a small comfort in a world that had offered her very little of it lately. But his shivers were growing more violent. He looked like he was about to collapse. "Yes," she said, the word out before she could second-guess it. "Coffee. It's all I have." She poured the steaming water into the mug, the dark powder dissolving into a fragrant cloud. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She handed it to him, his cold fingers brushing hers. The contact was surprisingly grounding. He cradled the mug in both hands, bringing it to his lips with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. "Lifesaver," he mumbled into the steam, his eyes closing briefly. The small cabin seemed to shrink with 2 people in it. The storm raged outside, a symphony of creaking wood and howling wind. Awkwardness settled between them, thick and palpable. He was a stranger. She was a fugitive of sorts. Yet, here they were, sharing her last coffee, united by the fury of the elements. He drank slowly, a little color returning to his face. "I was checking fence lines up on the ridge," he eventually explained, his voice stronger now. "Weather report said light rain." "Liars." He managed a weak smile. "This your place?" "Borrowed," she said, vague. "From a friend." He nodded, looking around the rustic interior. His gaze wasn't judgmental, just observant. "Cozy, if a bit drafty." "It has its charms," Alara said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. Then, because the silence felt too charged, "You live around here." "Born and raised," Ben confirmed. "Got a small place a few miles down the valley. Usually, I know these woods like the back of my hand, but this wideout, it's something else." The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the wind seemed to intensify, rattling the window panes in their frames. It became clear that Ben wasn't going anywhere soon. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through Alara. Having him here overnight? It was too risky. What if he recognized her from a picture? What if he asked too many questions? But then she looked at him, huddled closer to the stove, the empty mug still clutched in his hands, and the pragmatic, compassionate part of her took over. She couldn't, in good conscience, send him back out into that maelstrom. "You should probably stay," she said, the words feeling heavy. "At least until this blows over." He looked up, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. "I don't want to impose, Ellie. You've done more than enough." "It's not safe out there," she insisted. "And I have. Well, I have a floor." She gestured vaguely to the small, braided rug in front of the unused fireplace. He gave a small, tired smile. "A floor sounds like heaven right now. Thank you." The next few hours passed in a strange, suspended reality. Alara found a couple of threadbare blankets in a dusty chest. She offered him the last of her crackers and a tin of sardines she'd been saving, a meager meal they shared in near silence, broken only by the storm's roar and the crackle of the stove. He didn't press her for details about herself, for which she was immensely grateful. He mostly talked about the woods, the changing seasons, the stubbornness of his old truck, simple, grounding things. Alara found herself listening, really listening, for the first time in what felt like years. There was a calmness about him, a solidity that was the antithesis of the brittle, high-strung world she'd fled. He noticed the small, leather-bound book of poetry she kept on the windowsill, a relic from her old life she couldn't bear to part with. Keats, he observed, surprising her. My mom used to read his stuff. A shared, unexpected connection. She found herself asking about his life, his work. He described mending fences, clearing fallen trees, the quiet satisfaction of physical labor. He spoke of the community in the small town in the valley, the way people looked out for each other. It sounded like a different universe. As the evening wore on, the initial awkwardness began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, unspoken truce. He was meticulous about not taking up too much space, his movements careful in the cramped cabin. She noticed the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he helped her secure a rattling shutter, the gentle way he spoke, even when talking about frustrating things like a stubborn mule he once owned. There was a kindness in his eyes that seemed genuine, unforced. She, in turn, tried to be a good hostess with her limited resources. She kept the stove fed, offered him the slightly less lumpy pillow she owned. He noticed her hands, unaccustomed to rough work, and the way she'd wince when a splinter from the firewood pricked her skin. He saw the faint, lingering shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He didn't comment, but his gaze was gentle. Once, when the wind howled with particular ferocity, making the cabin groan, she jumped. He looked over from his makeshift bed on the floor. It'll hold, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. These old places were built to last. And for some reason, she believed him. She found herself talking a little more, too. Not about her past, but about small things, a bird she'd seen, her struggles with the wood stove, the surprising beauty of the frost patterns on the window in the morning. He listened patiently, offering practical advice about the stove, sharing his own observations about the local wildlife. It was easy. Too easy. A dangerous warmth began to spread through her, a feeling of, not quite safety, but a lessening of the constant, sharp-edged fear. Being with Ben felt like a temporary reprieve from her self-imposed isolation. He was a slice of normalcy, of simple human connection, in her upended world. The irony was, her act of kindness in offering him shelter was, in a way, sheltering her too, from the crushing weight of her loneliness. As the night deepened and the storm began to reluctantly subside, a quiet settled in the cabin. Ben was asleep on the floor, his breathing deep and even. Alara lay on her narrow cot, listening to the dying wind and the steady rhythm of his breath. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't empty. It was shared. She felt a pang of something akin to regret that morning would come, that he would leave, and she would be alone again with her secrets. She was starting to like this quiet, unassuming man, and that scared her almost as much as being found. What if this brief connection made her careless? What if feeling safe was the biggest risk of all? The morning dawned crisp and startlingly clear. The world outside was blanketed in a thin layer of wet snow, glistening under a pale sun. The air was cold but fresh, washed clean by the storm. Ben was already awake, attempting to quietly fold the blanket she'd given him. "Morning," he said, his voice still a little rough from sleep, but his eyes clear. "Looks like the worst is over." "It does," Alara agreed, a knot forming in her stomach. This was it. He would leave, and the fragile bubble of companionship would pop. "I should get going," he said, looking towards the door. "Need to check on my place, make sure a tree didn't decide to redecorate my roof." He offered a small, almost shy smile. "Ellie, thank you. For everything. You really did save me some serious trouble last night." Anyone would have done the same, she deflected, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. In her old world, many wouldn't have. "Not everyone," he said softly, his gaze holding hers for a moment. "Especially not with their last cup of coffee." A faint blush rose on her cheeks. He remembered. There was an awkward pause, the unspoken hanging in the air. What now? A polite goodbye? An exchange of numbers that would never be used? "Well," he said, shifting his weight, "if you're ever down in the valley, I make a pretty decent cup of real coffee. Not instant." It was a casual invitation, but it felt like more. A lifeline, perhaps. Before Alara could formulate a reply, a sound intruded. A distant, rhythmic whirring, growing steadily louder. Both of them tensed, looking at each other, then towards the sky. Ben frowned. "That's not a local sound." The whirring became a distinct, powerful chopping. Thump, 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 thump. It was getting closer. Fast. Alara's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. She'd heard it countless times landing on the manicured lawns of her family's estates, on the helipads of exclusive resorts. It was a helicopter. Panic, stark and visceral, seized her. She backed away from the window, her eyes wide with terror. Ben was looking at her, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern, then to a dawning, bewildered understanding as he saw the sheer panic on her face. Ellie? What is it? The helicopter was almost overhead now, the noise deafening, the cabin vibrating slightly. It was circling, clearly searching. And then it began to descend, targeting the small clearing right in front of the cabin. They found me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Oh God, they found me. Ben stared at her, then out at the descending machine, sleek, expensive, with a crest on its side she recognized with a sickening lurch. The Vance family crest. Who found you? He asked, his voice low, but the noise of the rotors was already drowning him out. The helicopter landed with a final whoosh, kicking up snow and pine needles. The door slid open, and two men in dark, severe suits jumped out, their eyes scanning the area before fixing on the cabin. Behind them, a figure began to emerge, a woman with an impeccably styled silver bob and an expression of glacial disapproval. Her mother. Alara felt like she couldn't breathe. The fragile peace of the morning, the warmth of the shared coffee, the tentative connection with Ben, it all shattered like ice under a hammer blow. The gilded cage had found her. Ben looked from the imposing figures striding towards the cabin to Alara's ashen face. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The expensive-looking, though worn, book of poetry. Her careful, educated speech. Her unfamiliarity with basic rustic life. Ellie was clearly not just Ellie. Alara, her mother's voice, crisp and commanding even over the idling rotors, cut through the air. Enough of this melodrama. You've caused quite enough trouble. Get your things. We're leaving. Alara stood frozen, trapped in the blinding glare of her two worlds colliding. The man who had shared her last coffee, whose quiet presence had felt like a sanctuary, now looked at her with a mixture of shock and something unreadable. Betrayal? Confusion? She couldn't tell. Her mother's gaze flicked dismissively over Ben, then back to Alara. And who, pray tell, is this? Local color. The confrontation was swift and brutal, though fought with words sharper than any blade. It took place right there, in the snow-dusted clearing, the helicopter a throbbing, metallic beast in the background, its presence a constant reminder of the power Alara had tried to escape. Mother, I'm not going, Alara said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. The words felt monumental, like shifting a mountain. Her mother, Catherine Vance, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Don't be absurd, Alara. Your little adventure is over. Sterling is waiting. The arrangements for the wedding are proceeding. Your father is displeased. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. I don't care about Sterling, or the arrangements, or father's displeasure, Alara said, finding a core of defiance she didn't know she possessed. It was fueled, in part, by the memory of Ben's simple kindness, by the taste of that last cup of coffee, a symbol of her own agency, however small. Ben stood silently by the cabin door, watching, his expression unreadable. He was an unintentional witness to the unraveling of her carefully constructed anonymity. She couldn't look at him, ashamed of the deception, however necessary she'd felt it was. You are a Vance, her mother stated, as if that explained everything, as if it were an unbreakable law of nature. You have responsibilities. My only responsibility is to myself, Alara countered, her voice gaining strength. To not live a life that feels like a beautifully decorated prison. I tasted something else here, Mother. Something real. She chanced to glance at Ben, whose eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of something, understanding? In their depths. One of the suited men stepped forward. Ms. Vance, we've been instructed to escort you. I'm not going, Alara repeated, standing her ground. She was terrified. Her knees felt weak, her palms were sweating, but the image of Ben's quiet resilience the night before, facing the storm, flashed in her mind. If he could face the elements, she could face this. The standoff stretched, taut, and unbearable. Her mother's face was a mask of controlled fury. This was not how she had envisioned her daughter's retrieval. She had expected tears, immediate capitulation. Alara, her mother said, her voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. Think very carefully. You have no money, no resources. This rustic fantasy will not last. What will you do when the reality of your situation truly sets in? It was a valid question, one that had haunted Alara's own quiet moments. But looking at the unyielding forest, at the humble cabin that had, for a short time, been her sanctuary, and at Ben, who was still just standing there, a silent, solid presence, an answer began to form. I'll figure it out, Alara said. It wasn't a grand plan. but it was honest. I'm not that girl anymore. The one who does what she's told without question. She took a deep breath. You can tell Sterling the wedding is off. Permanently. For a moment, absolute silence reigned, broken only by the thrum of the helicopter. Catherine Vance looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time and not liking what she saw. The defiance was new, unwelcome. Then, with a curt nod to her men, her mother turned. Very well, Alara. If this is the life you choose, then live it. But do not come crawling back when it inevitably falls apart. Without another word, she swept back towards the helicopter, her men following. The door slammed shut. The rotors spun faster, whipping up a vortex of snow and debris. Alara shielded her eyes, watching as the machine lifted, ponderous at first, then agile, shrinking against the vast blue canvas of the sky until it was just a distant speck. And then, nothing. Silence descended, vast and ringing. Alara slowly lowered her hand, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had said no. She turned to Ben, her heart pounding. His expression was complex, surprise, respect, and a hint of something softer, warmer. Wow, he said, breaking the silence. Just one word, but it held a world of meaning. Yeah, she breathed out, a shaky laugh escaping her. Wow. An awkwardness settled between them again, but it was different now. The secrets were out, at least the biggest one. She was exposed, vulnerable, but also, strangely, lighter. So, Alara Vance, he said, testing the name. It sounded foreign even to her own ears now. She winced. Guilty. Though I prefer Ellie. He nodded slowly. Ellie it is. He paused, then asked, his voice gentle, are you okay? Tears welled in her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of fear, of sheer emotional exhaustion. I think so. I don't know what I'm going to do, Ben. She's right. I have nothing. He looked around the clearing, at the small cabin, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, he said, his eyes twinkling. You've still got a floor. And I believe I owe you a cup of real coffee. He gestured towards the path leading down into the valley. My truck's probably buried in snow, but it's downhill. And my cabin's a bit sturdier than this one. Warmer, too. And definitely has more coffee. Alara looked at him, at the genuine offer in his eyes. Her old life was gone, vanished with that helicopter. Her new life was a terrifying, exhilarating blank page. But she wasn't entirely alone. A small, watery smile touched her lips. Is it good coffee? Ben grinned. The best in the valley. Or at least, the best I can make. He extended a hand, not to help her over a log or into a carriage, but as an equal, an invitation. Come on, Ellie. Let's go get that coffee. She looked at his outstretched hand, strong and calloused, then up at his kind, steady gaze. The fear was still there, a faint tremor in the background, but for the first time, hope was louder. She had given away her last coffee to a shivering stranger, and in return, it seemed, she might have found a new beginning. She placed her hand in his. It felt surprisingly right. The path ahead was uncertain, but as they walked away from the little cabin, towards the promise of warmth and genuine coffee, Alara felt a sense of freedom she'd only ever dreamed of. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance yet, but a quiet, hopeful step forward, together. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the snow-covered pines, the small, borrowed cabin stood empty, a silent witness to a profound choice, a chapter closed, and a new one, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed possibilities, just beginning. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken understanding, the comfortable silence of two souls who had found an unexpected harbor in each other, a fragile promise against the vast, unknown wilderness of what came next. He glanced at her, a small, reassuring smile playing on his lips, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this messy, uncertain, coffee-fueled journey was exactly where she was supposed to be.